even a disdain for this country. We've seen it recently in the unfortunate but staggering case that we've become aware of in Minnesota. Somalian groups who have come here to defraud the United States to the tune of billions of dollars, submitting fake invoices, at least motivated in part for personal enrichment, and then to fund terrorist groups back home, our adversaries. And one of the points that I find most disgraceful from the other side of the aisle, they would rather talk about Secretary Noem rather than these threats that we are trying to combat. And they also say that this is strictly a race issue. That's a disgusting accusation. From my experience in law enforcement, there were people from all over the world who exploited the open border policies or weak legal immigration policies to come here, whether they were from Eastern Europe, China, Russia, the Middle East, Northern Africa, Pacific Islands.
Right now, you're watching what happens when the American Fascist Project finds its scapegoat, and you need to understand that this moment is not accidental or impulsive, but calculated with terrifying precision. Trump last week labeled Minnesota Somalis as garbage and has linked his administration's immigration crackdown against Minnesota's large Somali community to a series of fraud cases, but what you just witnessed in that congressional testimony goes far beyond prosecuting actual crime, because what we're seeing is the deliberate weaponization of legitimate law enforcement concerns to justify collective punishment and ethnic targeting. The congressman's rhetoric about fraud cases, where money from these fraud cases was being funneled to the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab, functions as a permission structure for dehumanization, even though no one has been able to provide evidence that any money from these fraud cases in Minnesota have gone to fund terrorism in Somalia, which means we're watching evidence-free conspiracy theories being laundered into congressional testimony, and here's where it gets absolutely chilling, because this is how genocidal rhetoric begins. You want to talk about what's actually happening in Minnesota. Let me give you the facts that don't fit their narrative of invasion and terror, because about 84,000 of the 260,000 Somalis in the U.S. live in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. The overwhelming majority are American citizens, and almost 58% were born in the U.S., and 87% of the foreign-born are naturalized citizens, which means we're talking about American families being targeted by their own government. And when this congressman says Somalians came here to defraud the United States, as if an entire ethnic community arrived on our shores with criminal intent, he's not describing reality, but constructing a fascist mythology where black Muslim refugees become enemy combatants in the homeland, where asylum seekers fleeing civil war become sleeper agents for Al-Shabaab, where American citizens who happen to be of Somali descent are rendered perpetually foreign and inherently suspect. Because yes, fraud occurred. Prosecutors have put the losses from one case known as Feeding Our Future at $300 million, with more than 90% of the people charged in those three cases being of Somali descent for a total of 86. But here's what the congressman conveniently omits when he's busy constructing his narrative of coordinated ethnic criminality. 72 of the 78 defendants in Feeding Our Future were Somali, though the alleged ringleader was a white American woman, and the fraud, while egregious, does not justify revoking legal protections for Somali immigrants, since while the lion's share of this monumental theft was likely perpetrated by people of Somali descent, the vast majority of this community had nothing to do it. This is basic logic that any functioning democracy should understand, that you don't collectively punish an entire ethnic group for the crimes of individuals unless your actual goal is ethnic cleansing, which is precisely what the Trump administration has signaled with Trump announcing he was ending temporary protected status for Somalis in Minnesota, citing fraudulent money laundering activity, affecting about 700 people nationwide, when the defendants in Feeding Our Future and Medicaid fraud are nearly all American citizens, so the policy literally cannot address the problem it claims to solve, which means the cruelty is the point. And let's be devastatingly clear about what this congressman is doing when he pivots to his experience in law enforcement and says there were criminals from all over the world who exploited the open border policies, trying to paper over his explicit targeting of Muslims by adding this perfunctory diversity disclaimer, because this is the most cynical rhetorical move imaginable. He just spent his entire testimony constructing an elaborate conspiracy theory about Somali groups coming here specifically to fund terrorism, then throws in, oh, and also Russians and Chinese people committed crimes too, as if that somehow absolves him of the fact that he titled this entire moral panic around a specific Muslim community. This is the I have a black friend defense applied to Islamophobia, and it's particularly grotesque because it has become an acceptable plank within the Republican Party to demonize Muslims, with Republican officials in 49 states having openly attacked Muslims with words and proposed legislation since 2015, and few have faced repercussions. The infrastructure of Islamophobia is now so embedded in conservative politics that, since 2015, local and state Republican officials in virtually every state have engaged in anti-Muslim rhetoric, attacking Islam, or proposing laws targeting or disproportionately affecting Muslims. And what we're watching in this hearing is the normalization reaching its apex. Now, the fraud itself demands serious investigation because government programs were catastrophically exploited, with the Housing Stabilization Services Program projected to cost $2.6 million per year in 2020, but paying out $21 million in 2021, $42 million in 2022, $74 million in 2024, which represents a genuine failure of oversight that should prompt reform. But here's what's getting memory hold in this moral panic about Muslim criminality. There's scant mention of state agencies and investigation stories. Minnesota officials provided federal authorities with little or no evidence that Feeding Our Future misappropriated government money, and the Minnesota Reformer and the Star Tribune have reported that state officials could have done more to stop or investigate fraud. The fraud happened because states' cowardly Democrat officials were reluctant to act, tolerating if not tacitly allowing the fraud and ignoring whistleblowers to avoid political backlash among the Somali community and accusations of racism, according to White House sources, which is conservative framing designed to make anti-racism itself the problem. But even accepting this critique means acknowledging that state failures enabled the fraud, which means the solution is better oversight and enforcement, not ethnic scapegoating and mass deportation. But that's not what's happening, because federal counterterrorism sources confirm that millions of dollars in stolen funds have been sent back to Somalia, where they ultimately landed in the hands of the terror group Al-Shabaab, according to a City Journal investigation by Christopher Rufo. And yes, that's the same Christopher Rufo who manufactured the critical race theory panic, and who said Somalis are stealing billions of dollars from American taxpayers, and called on President Donald Trump to revoke Temporary Protected Status (TPS) for all Somalis in Minnesota, after which the president obliged. So we're watching a right-wing activist with a documented history of fabricating moral panics to advance white nationalist policy goals, claim without providing verifiable evidence that fraud precedes funded terrorism, then watching the federal government implement collective punishment based on those claims, and Thorpe and Rufo's vulture journalism provides an opening to those who seek to dismiss the problem of fraud in Minnesota as right-wing demagoguery, undermining the hard work done to shed light on and prosecute the rampant fraud that has beset Minnesota's public programs, which means their Islamophobic framing is actually counterproductive to addressing the genuine problem. Because here's what makes this so sinister, and what you need to understand about the mechanics of fascist scapegoating. Democratic U.S. Rep. Dema said most Somalis are angry about the fraud because this also has an impact on Somalis, because we are also taxpayers in Minnesota, we also could have benefited from the program and the money that was stolen, and she accused Trump of an unhealthy obsession on the community. And she's absolutely right, because Somali Minnesotans generate at least $500 million in income annually and pay about $67 million in state and local taxes, with the estimated impact of these workers in Minnesota about $8 billion, which means this community is a massive economic engine contributing to Minnesota's prosperity. Somali refugees got jobs in the hospitality industry, as taxi drivers and more, forming a sizable Somali community in and around the Twin Cities, and the Somali refugees who settled in Minneapolis and St. Paul were also attracted by the fact that Minnesota was known for Martasor, which translates to hospitality in Somali, with the state's liberal attitude and social behavior mirroring the immigrants' own values, which is the actual story of how Minnesota became home to the largest Somali community in America, not through invasion, but through refugee resettlement, not through conspiracy, but through the fundamental American promise that people fleeing violence can rebuild their lives through hard work. But Trump doesn't want you to know that the Somali population has continued to grow in Minnesota and find ways to give back, with community members saying right now, wherever you go, still we're serving the people, we are serving the community, we are serving the state, or that the late 90s and early 2000s saw hundreds of Somali entrepreneurs open businesses in Minnesota, and families establish themselves in areas of Minneapolis that had fallen into disrepair, revitalizing neighborhoods that had been abandoned. He wants you focused on 86 criminal defendants, so you don't see the 84,000 American community members, wants you terrified of Al-Shabaab, so you don't notice the Somali American doctors and teachers and small business owners paying taxes and raising families and contributing to the civic fabric. This is the propaganda technique of Synecdoche weaponized for ethnic cleansing, where the part is made to represent the whole, where individual criminality becomes group essence, where the exception becomes the rule, through sheer repetitive insistence, and the timing here is no accident, because the rise in demonstration activity comes in the wake of multiple policy changes and operations aimed at carrying out mass deportations under the new Trump administration, with inflammatory anti-immigrant statements from the White House, members of Congress, and other prominent political and media figures contributing to the rise in demonstrations, as many groups have organized to support immigrant rights and counter dehumanizing attacks that can raise the risk of violence in their communities. We're in a moment where over 97% of all immigration-related demonstrations reported in 2025 have been in support of immigrant rights, building on a trend that began in the initial aftermath of the 2024 election, which means grassroots America is rejecting this fascist turn, but the question is whether our institutions will hold, because advocates warn that Trump's anti-Somali rhetoric has fueled fear in U.S. communities and anger abroad, and Ilhan Omar said, "I think it is also really important for us to remember that this kind of hateful rhetoric and this level of dehumanizing can lead to dangerous actions by people who listen to the president, which is not speculation but historical pattern, not alarmism but pattern recognition." The research is unambiguous on this point. Islamophobia plays a significant role in shaping the experiences of Muslim immigrants in the U.S. immigration system, with fear, prejudice, and hatred against Islam and Muslims, fueled by political rhetoric, media portrayals, and public misconceptions, especially after 9/11, and political rhetoric and media portrayals having often framed Muslim immigrants as security threats, while media outlets disproportionately focus on stories linking Muslims to terrorism, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, and creating an environment of fear. And this creates measurable harm because nearly 8% of American Muslims surveyed reported a suicide attempt in their lifetimes, higher than among other religious groups, with researchers attributing the relatively high suicide attempts among American Muslims to discrimination, Islamophobia, and stigma surrounding mental health, and almost all Muslim respondents, nearly 94%, saying that Islamophobia affects their mental and emotional well-being. This is what stochastic terrorism looks like in practice, where political leaders create the conditions for violence without explicitly calling for it, where dehumanizing rhetoric becomes the accelerant for hate crimes and discrimination and psychological devastation. And let's talk about what's happening right now in real time, because Florida Republican Congressman Randy Fine is facing calls for his resignation after saying that mainstream Muslims should be destroyed, saying on X, Rep. Fine on how to deal with mainstream Muslims, "I don't know how you make peace with those who seek your destruction. I think you destroy them first," which was just days ago, and job candidates have promised voters that they'll use their office to stem what they claim is an invasion of Texas by Muslims, who make up 2% of the state's population, with Congressman Chip Roy, who is running for Texas Attorney General, recently calling Islam cultural rot on a right-wing podcast and saying, "We're going to lose our country if we don't address this stuff," while Governor Greg Abbott continues to ramp up his attacks on Muslim groups, ordering investigations into what he claims are Sharia courts, and designating the Council on American Islamic Relations a foreign terror organization. This is happening now, in December 2025, and the velocity of escalation should terrify anyone with even a passing familiarity with how authoritarian regimes consolidate power, because you don't call for the destruction of mainstream religious adherents unless you're building towards something catastrophic. The historical parallels are so obvious they're almost boring to enumerate. Germany didn't start with gas chambers but with rhetoric about Jewish criminality and foreign infiltration. Rwanda didn't start with machetes but with radio broadcasts calling Tutsis cockroaches. Bosnia didn't start with ethnic cleansing but with politicians warning about Muslim demographic threats. And now we have American congressmen testifying about Somali groups coming here at least motivated in part for personal enrichment and then to fund terrorist groups back home, which is the blood libel updated for the war on terror, the eternal conspiracy theory of the criminally disloyal minority, updated for our Islamophobic moment. This rhetoric constructs Somali Americans as inherently treasonous, as enemy agents masquerading as refugees, as a fifth column whose very presence represents an existential threat requiring extraordinary measures. And what are those extraordinary measures looking like? Because U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement plans to target Minnesota and its Somali population in an upcoming immigration enforcement operation, which is ethnic targeting by any definition, and the communities affected, Somali, Haitian, African diasporas, Muslim immigrants, and mixed-status families, experience immediate increases in harassment, discrimination, and violence when this rhetoric intensifies. We're watching the construction of a permission structure for state violence, where congressional testimony and White House statements and Fox News segments all work together to create a reality where targeting Somali Americans becomes not just acceptable, but patriotic, not just legal, but necessary, not just policy, but survival. The congressman's complaint that Democrats would rather talk about Secretary Noem rather than these threats that we are trying to combat is particularly rich given that Trump cited the scandal as a reason to end temporary protected status for Somalis in Minnesota, writing on Truth Social, "Somali gangs are terrorizing the people of that great state, and billions of dollars are missing," appearing to be reacting to a recent report from a conservative activist that said Somalis stole the money to use it for terrorism, but that claim, which has circulated since 2018, lacks evidence. So Republicans are manufacturing a crisis based on unsubstantiated claims, then demanding Democrats focus on their manufactured crisis instead of actual cabinet-level corruption, which is gaslighting as governance, projection as political strategy. Because here's the endgame that we need to name explicitly. This isn't about fraud prevention or counterterrorism or border security. Those are the pretexts. This is about constructing a category of people who can be deported en masse, detained indefinitely, stripped of legal protections, excluded from the civic community, and eventually eliminated from the American landscape. When Trump said on Wednesday that Omar shouldn't be allowed to be a congresswoman, and I'm sure people are looking at that, and she should be thrown the hell out of our country. Omar told NPR that Trump's words about Somalis were vile and said it was not surprising because he has trafficked in racism, in xenophobia, in bigotry, in Islamophobia for as long as he has held office, and she's right, but it's worse than that because he's not just trafficking in these ideologies, he's implementing them as policy, he's weaponizing the apparatus of the state to actualize the fever dreams of white Christian nationalism, and the Democrats' failure here is its own kind of catastrophe, because Democratic farmer-labor elected officials should address the issue of fraud more forcefully, and there should be fewer instances of Somali business owners reflexively organizing against measures designed to protect the integrity of our social programs, which is valid criticism about the political paralysis that enabled the fraud to metastasize. But that necessary accountability has been completely overtaken by the fascist exploitation of the situation, where legitimate concerns about program integrity have become the launching pad for ethnic persecution. The tragedy is that by failing to aggressively prosecute fraud when it was happening, Minnesota Democrats created the opening that Republicans are now driving a truck through, and that truck is loaded with deportation orders and surveillance programs and executive orders ending legal protections. What we're witnessing is the maturation of American Islamophobia into a comprehensive political program where Muslim voters have largely embraced the Democratic Party in the decades since 9/11, as Republican officials increasingly engaged in anti-Muslim rhetoric and policies, with former President Donald Trump promising to bar all Muslims from entering the U.S. during his first presidential campaign, and as president imposing a travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries. But now that targeting has evolved from immigration restriction to internal deportation, from travel bans to ethnic raids, from excluding Muslims at the border to extracting them from American communities where they've lived for decades, this is the logical endpoint of the rhetoric, the policy conclusion of the premise, and anyone who tells you they didn't see this coming is either lying or catastrophically naive. The congressman's testimony is terrifying not because it's anomalous, but because it's representative, not because it's extreme, but because it's mainstream, not because it's a slip, but because it's the strategy. When Republican officials can stand in congressional hearings and baselessly accuse entire ethnic communities of terrorism funding without consequence, when a sitting president can call American residents garbage and face no institutional pushback, when governors can designate civil rights organizations as terrorist entities and the courts don't immediately strike it down, we're not in a democracy testing its limits, we're in a democracy abandoning its commitments. And for Somali Americans watching this, for Muslims across the country seeing this pattern, for anyone who understands how genocidal logic builds momentum, the question is not whether to be alarmed, but how to build the resistance necessary to stop what's coming, because it is coming unless we make it impossible for them to proceed. The testimony you just watched is not a warning sign, it's the green light, and our response right now will determine whether American fascism succeeds, or whether the promise of multiculturalism and religious pluralism survives this authoritarian moment.